Welcome to Shellphone, the podcast that gives the ocean its very own hotline. Join us as we hear from ocean stewards, discover threats to ocean health, and learn ways we can all answer the ocean's call. This podcast is brought to you in part by the Tampa Bay Estuary Program and Coastal Creative. I'm Harmony Dawson, and joining us this episode is Jo Huxster, who will be telling us all about the how, why, and what's of climate change communication. So to start us off, can you give us a little introduction to yourself?
I am an associate professor of environmental studies at Eckerd College, and I teach classes on environmental communication and climate change communication. I also research the best ways to communicate about climate change and just sort of public understanding of environmental issues like climate change. And I teach a class on climate change science fiction, which we're going to talk about today, too.
And I did take that class when I was studying at Eckerd. I really enjoyed it.
I really enjoyed teaching it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So to give us just a basis for our conversation, I'd like to go over what climate change is and how we see its impacts, specifically like with sea level rise, since we are ocean focused on the podcast, but also in general, what climate change can look like.
Yeah, so you'll frequently hear the words climate change and global warming used sort of interchangeably, but they're actually slightly different scientifically. Global warming, which is an older term, refers to the increase in Earth's average temperature over long periods of time. So a change in the climate, not in weather. Climate change is a more all-encompassing term. It involves the change in the temperature, but also changes in precipitation, changes in storm frequency, increased droughts versus increased flooding. Those things are all part of climate change. And we know that the climate has been changing since the Industrial Revolution due to human activity, specifically and mostly due to the burning of fossil fuels. So anything that we use to power our vehicles, but also to generate electricity, to run really high heat processes for industry, all of that stuff contributes to climate change. And we also know that agriculture is a big contributor as well to climate change. So we, as humans, have created this problem. The climate does change naturally, which people will talk about, but what we know now is that the specific increase we're seeing at this moment and the speed with which it's happening is due to human activity.
Great. I was going to ask about the difference between this climate change versus the regular cycles that the climate goes through, which you touched on already, which is great. So
I can talk about some of the impacts of climate change.
Yes, that would be great.
So some of the things that we see, one of the biggest things we see, and that's ocean related, of course, is sea level rise. And we have seen sea level rise since the late 1800s or since the Industrial Revolution. It's been rising more quickly as years have gone on. So we're currently at about 3.7 millimeters per year of sea level rise, which doesn't sound like a lot, but we've seen an average globally of about 8 inches of sea level rise in the last 100 years. And what we know is that it happens differently in different places. So the east coast of the United States, for example, is one of the places where sea level is rising the fastest. So it's risen about a foot on the east coast. And we're actually looking at probably another foot of sea level rise on the East Coast by 2050. So that's 2 feet of sea level rise. That's a large amount of water. But the rate globally is about 3.7 millimeters per year. It's faster in places like the East Coast of the U.S. It's slower on the West Coast. But in addition to sea level rise, we are seeing increased storm power in particular. So here in Florida, we're seeing hurricanes. We're not really seeing necessarily more hurricanes because of climate change, but we're seeing stronger hurricanes. So the last major hurricane we had here, for example, Hurricane Milton, that was the second one, right? Yes. We had Helene and Milton back to back, and it got confusing. Milton picked up speed and strength really, really quickly in a way that we had never seen a hurricane do before. It went from a Category 1 to a Category 5 really quickly. And those kinds of things are going to be happening more and more often. For storms, for example, that happens because the water is warmer and hurricanes get their strength from the warmth of the ocean. But we're seeing heavier rainfall in parts of the earth that already have a fair amount of rainfall. We're seeing more of it, so that's a problem. In places that are already dry, we're seeing more drought and more prolonged drought. And that can cause things like wildfires. So we're seeing a change in wildfire season. So those are all consequences of climate change. And they're not all hot consequences. So for example, we've seen a change in the Gulf Stream, and we've seen a change in the way that air moves over the top of the United States that has actually created a zone that storms will stall in the northern part of the United States. And that can increase the actual snowfall from storms that are coming down from the Arctic Circle, getting stalled over places like Chicago and dumping feet of snow. And that is a new thing that is happening because of climate change. And it all has to do with changes in how the ocean circulates heat and how the air is circulating heat in the atmosphere above us.
Yeah. I think the kind of rebranding of global warming into climate change, I feel has helped people understand the broad applications of it rather than just everything's getting warmer.
Yeah. Just because it snows one day doesn't mean that climate change isn't happening.
Yeah.
But when you call it global warming, it sounds like it's just supposed to get hotter. There's actually some really good research, though, that shows that climate change isn't that great of a term either, because it just doesn't make people it doesn't evoke a lot of emotion, right? Change, okay, change is good, right? So there's rebranding happening yet again to climate emergency or climate crisis or something that has a little more oomph behind it than just change. But definitely climate change over global warming helps to illustrate that there's lots of different impacts, not just heat.
Yeah, I haven't really heard that specifically said before, but it makes a lot of sense. I have heard climate crisis as a term. Another question, you mentioned that things like sea level rise have different impacts in different areas or different rates. But I'd like to talk a little bit about how also different groups of people or people living in certain locations or in certain economic circumstances, things like that, are differently affected.
Yeah. So climate change is probably the largest environmental injustice we have on Earth right now. And one of the main reasons for that is that the people who are most responsible, who have created the most emissions and have driven the most of the climate change that we've seen now, are the people who are least affected by the consequences. So here in the United States, we do have climate consequences, but we're a relatively wealthy nation. We have ways of adapting. However, and we have been the top emitter for most of history. 25% of historic emissions come from the United States. So even though China is emitting more than we do now, historically we have done the most damage. But we are not the most affected. The people most affected are in small island nations, which have almost no climate impact. People living in parts of Africa that are experiencing droughts. Again, almost no climate impact. So we're seeing intense impacts for people who had very, very little to do with what's happening. So that's an injustice in and of itself. And then even within countries, you're going to see greater impacts to folks who are marginalized in some way. If you don't have the economic or political freedom to do something about your circumstances, then you're going to be more heavily impacted and you're not going to have anything you can do about it. You're not going to be able to adapt or move because you just can't afford to. So it's an injustice within countries and between countries as well.
Do you think that there's kind of a relation between how people or groups who have, or industries even, who have the greatest impact but don't feel the negative effects of that? Do you think that kind of ties into how much responsibility they feel to make changes since they're not getting that direct impact onto themselves? Yeah,
I think it's really hard. You know, we want to believe that we are all good people and that we all want the best for the world, but it's really hard to feel motivated to change something that's not impacting you. But I think that most people believe they're not being impacted, and most people are being impacted in one way or another. You know, there's lots of discussion about the price of groceries right now and inflation. some of that price increase has to do with climate change. Some of our food is already more expensive or will become more expensive because of climate change. If you live in a coastal area, you are already being affected. If you live in some place that is dry, you're already being affected. And even parts of the United States where you aren't in a drought area or you're not getting flooded, you're still seeing impacts with the ecosystems around you that are going to start impacting you. And this even goes down to things like people's hobbies, right? If you're a hunter or if you fish, those things are impacted. The species that are existing and where they live, that's already being impacted by climate. So I think most people don't realize how it relates to them. But if you don't realize how it relates to you, you're way less likely to do something about it. You might say, oh, that really stinks for the people in Bangladesh who've been underwater all year. But you don't care about it as much as if it were in your own backyard or your family or you. And that's just sort of part of who we are and how we work.
Before we move on to talking more about how climate change communicators get out information and messages about this, what are some good sources that people who want to learn more about climate change can go to? Yeah,
so if you are looking for the science and you feel like you have a pretty good grasp on scientific language, jargon, the premier source is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They produce reports every couple of years. The reports are really in depth, and they usually have a summary for policymakers at the front that's still a little bit difficult to understand, but it is more palatable than if you read the whole research report. And they'll give you the latest projections. So it's a UN panel, and it's made up of climate scientists all around the world bringing together the best research. If you want something that is a little bit more translated for the general audience, both NASA and NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, have really good websites. So I recommend NASA and NOAA for where you can look up information that's easier to understand and has, again, really recent projections on it.
Okay, so the main topic of the episode, climate change communication. I think this also goes with just science communication in general, but having the separate sector of climate change adds a little bit of urgency and purpose to science communication in general. So there are different types of communication, some being one-on-one conversations, academic sources, or news articles, and then there's the whole side of entertainment media, so like books, movies, shows, which we'll be talking about some today. But can you give maybe just like a little introduction into these kinds of sources and maybe like what audiences some sources are better for getting towards, or why there needs to be all of these different kinds of communication?
Yeah, there needs to be all the different kinds. It needs to be everywhere. We need to be talking about it in all sorts of media. Yeah, so, there's traditional news media, and we are seeing more climate coverage in traditional news media. And this is aimed at the general public and should be understandable, palatable to anyone. And one example, the New York Times has a whole climate section now, and you can get up-to-date news from them at any point. Those types of sources are really valuable, but I also like those in that you can find where they're getting their information and then look that up as well. I do think that getting past just the news is really important, getting into popular culture. So things like books and movies and TV shows, I think that really brings in a broader audience. It brings in a younger audience as well. I think that there aren't really that many people sitting around watching the news anymore. Social media is, of course, a really important way to communicate about climate change, again, for getting a younger audience as well. And then we're communicating about climate change or about our environmental choices all of the time. Anytime you are choosing to carry around a water bottle that is reusable, you're communicating something about your values. All the conversations that we have that we tie back to climate change, they're really important to helping change the social norms around climate. Right now, a lot of folks are scared to talk about climate change. They're afraid that they're going to have to fight with someone, or maybe that they don't have enough information and they might mess something up. And the more often that we talk about it, the more often the people around us are going to feel comfortable talking about it as well. If it becomes something that everybody is doing, then you're going to be making it something called a social norm, something that's an acceptable form of conversation for anybody. And that's sort of one of my goals in life, is to change the climate around climate change conversations, change the way that people view climate change conversations, and make it so that it's something that they're not afraid to talk about. Because if we're scared to talk about it, if we're not talking about it, then it can't be that important. We're not going to vote on it or make policy on it or take any actions necessary if we aren't able to have those conversations. So that's sort of like my baseline. I want everybody talking about it. But, I love seeing it in art. I love seeing photographic essays that have to do with climate change. I love writing, different forms of writing that have climate change in them. In my Cli-Fi class, we read short stories about climate change. I want to see it everywhere because we need it to be front and center in how we're thinking, so that we actually do something about it.
Yeah. I also love seeing different creative outlets in general, but also when they're applied to a specific topic or field that is creating like a merger between the creative side and something else. I think that's really awesome to see. I also enjoy writing. So
yeah.
all of that. We've had some episodes about data art, science art, and then also like writing children's books, things like that. All of that is really amazing.
I have a 5-year-old, and we have several books that have climate change somehow involved in them, which is awesome. So I love to see it in children's books as well.
Yeah. With all these different kinds of media, there are also a lot of different emotions that they can tap into. So like fear, anxiety, or the more positive side of hope, humor, things like that. And you've spoken about this on your page before. Can you talk a little bit about what tapping into different emotions kind of does, and like maybe what's more effective than something else? I know tapping into the more negative emotions doesn't always have the best outcomes, especially like guilt and things like that. But
so, I think most people who really want to communicate about climate change, their first instinct is to go with fear, to try to make the audience afraid. And there is some place for that. I mean, climate change is scary, and you don't want to be, toxically positive and say everything's going to be all right so that nobody does anything because they're just like, okay, yeah, someone's going to solve this. Doesn't have to be me. But if you take fear too far, people tend to shut down. If you take the doom and the gloom and the sadness and heaviness of it too far, people just start to say, you know what? This is too much for me. I feel like there's nothing I can do. I'm overwhelmed. I'm going to tune this out now. And, we all have a finite pool of worry. There's only so much that we can worry about. And if you're going through your day worrying about, what's for dinner and how many exams you have to take this next week and how things are going at work or whatever, you only have this much little piece of space left to think about global things. And then there's all these other global things going on as well. So we don't want to overwhelm people with things to worry about. So give them a little bit of the fear, make them see how real and important it is, but then step it back and we start to think about things like hope, think about things like positive actions that people can take. And, another thing that I really want to steer people away from is guilt. Like you mentioned, making people feel guilty is not going to inspire them to do much. There may be a small portion of the population who is inspired by guilt, but most people don't want to feel guilty. And so, again, they just shut it down. They don't want to think about it anymore. So instead of shaming people and telling them everything they're doing wrong, the better way to approach it is to tell them the things that they can do right, and to also help them see bigger picture items that they can do. A lot of climate communication gives you the scary stuff, and then they tell you things like, bike to work or change your light bulbs. And those tiny things don't feel like they have any impact. And guess what? They don't really. If you're doing it by yourself, they're not much of anything. So you want to help people see the actions that they can take that will affect more people than just them. So things like communicating, but also joining local environmental organizations, helping people understand how they can be politically active where they are, voting, of course. Those are the kinds of actions that have a bigger influence and that make people feel like they're doing something. And when we feel like we're doing something, when we feel effective, we're more likely to care about the issue and to keep working on it. Whereas if you tell me to change my light bulbs, A, it's not making that big of an impact, and B, I don't feel like it's making a big impact, and so I'm just not going to care because I'm going to feel like, well, I'm useless in this situation. And then, you want to instill a little bit of hope. You don't want people to walk away feeling like it's all over, so what's the point? And there are lots of examples of hopeful things that are going on and hopeful technologies that we have and hopeful movements that are building. And we need that hope to keep us going.
I think those smaller, more like everyday actions like biking to work or things like that are a little bit of a placebo maybe to help you feel better in the short term, but having an eye on the bigger picture actions is also the goal. Sometimes I see things like stop short at just the little things and then not going past it.
Yes, exactly.
Would you say that the overall goals of climate change communication are, on one hand, education and making the topic more like commonplace, like you were talking about before, and then on the other hand, getting people to take more like political action or community action?
Yeah, more impactful action than just doing the one little thing around the house, changing your shopping habits. Because those things put a lot of pressure on each of us to be perfect. And if you, calculate your own personal footprint and then you compare it to the things that corporations are doing or entire governments are doing, it's nothing. It's a tiny drop in the bucket. And you can be perfect all you want, but it's not going to fix climate change. And so you're putting so much pressure on yourself and making it seem like you have to do everything perfectly, and then it's still not saving the world. And so I want communication to be not about those things, but to be about, okay, if the problems are corporations, what can people do join together to change the way that corporations act? And we've done that many, many times. What can people do join together to change the way we work at the local government level? What kind of legislation can we get passed in our city that will have a much bigger impact than me riding my bicycle everywhere I go and feeling guilty that that's not enough?
Okay, let's move into talking about climate fiction specifically now. How would you define climate fiction?
Awesome. So climate fiction is my favorite genre, and I am a little obsessed. And climate fiction is obviously fictional stories, and they can be told in a bunch of different media. So books, short stories, film, TV shows. And they're fictional stories that have climate change somewhere in them. They don't have to be about climate change necessarily. Climate change could be just part of the background, part of the setting, or it could be the central conflict is something having to do with climate. But any fictional story that involves the climate in some tangible way, and it's something that's really clear as you're reading or watching or whatever you're doing. That's all climate fiction, and we now have examples of climate fiction in many, many different forms, which is really cool to see.
So climate fiction or cli-fi, that term came from sci-fi or science fiction.
Yeah.
Now I feel that it covers a lot more genres than just science fiction.
Yeah.
Like there's literary fiction, all kinds of different umbrellas that climate fiction can fall under.
Yeah.
Why is it important to have this name for this specific genre that falls into other genres?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think because it's a form of communication in and of itself to have this name, that this issue is so important that it can be tied to almost any other genre of fiction. I love that this term exists because I think it communicates that this changes everything. This touches everything. Anything can be connected to climate change. And you can have a book that is really just, a narrative about somebody's life and their relationships and have climate change be part of what's happening in the background. Or you can have a book that's like crazy science fiction, we're moving to a new planet, or we've colonized Antarctica because we can now because of climate change, and, there are magical beings, and that you can go that far and it can still be climate change fiction or climate fiction. So I think the term is really important because it connects everything together.
Do you think that there's a specific balance between fiction and reality that serves the purpose of climate fiction the best, or maybe that you find yourself leaning towards, or that you would like the genre as a whole to go more towards? Or do you think maybe having a mix along the entire spectrum is best? It's hard to say best, but...
Yeah. I mean, obviously it's a matter of personal taste. I lean towards wanting the science to be believable. It doesn't need to be perfectly accurate because we cannot predict the future with perfect accuracy. But I don't love when it takes things too far in a direction that isn't physically possible. Like, let's obey the laws of physics. That's a personal choice. I feel like it gives us a better depiction of what the future could be like, because what I love about cli-fi is it helps us envision possible futures where things got better, possible futures where things got worse, ways in which we adapted to the impacts of climate change. And if you take the science too far away, I think you lose that aspect of it, because then you're saying, okay, but this isn't a possible future because physics. So that, to me, is what I think. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I think it has to hit a realistic enough or believable enough storyline when it comes to the science.
The two examples that we'll be talking today are kind of on opposite ends of that spectrum. So there's the 2004 film Day After Tomorrow, which is very much further from the truth or like the actuality of science than our other example, which is the 2020 book Migrations by Charlotte McConaughey. We'll get into those a little bit later. Before that, I'm also interested in kind of the topic of the role of scientists and educators in creating this media. So I've been seeing a lot of, especially through this podcast, seeing a lot of scientists, researchers taking a hands-on role in creating media like this. But then also in other examples, there's someone who's, it's more of like a consultancy. Yeah. So fact-checking, if you will. Yeah. Do you have any...
I mean, again, because I lean towards wanting it to be realistic, I think there at least needs to be a fact checker. Again, not to say this is just a little bit unbelievable, but to say, no, wait, this can't physically happen. I'd like a little bit more of that. But again, that's my personal taste. I do know that there are, for example, the National Academy of Sciences is actually starting to contribute more to filmmaking and the accuracy of the science in the films, which I think is awesome. And I just think that it makes everything more believable when you have somebody in there saying what can happen and what can't happen. So I personally think that scientists should definitely get involved, or that there should be, arms of scientific organizations that a creator can tap into to get information or to find a fact checker. I think, that already exists, but the more of that, the better, in my opinion.
I remember in the first episode of Shellphone that I ever did, we talked a little bit about Finding Nemo and how that movie came together and the people who consulted on that, and then like the facts that were in Finding Nemo that were actually true or like kind of hidden in there that I didn't really realize until watching it back as an adult.
Yeah, there's some gems in there.
Yeah.
It's a great film.
Yeah, it is. In that same episode, we also talked about The Meg, which is very different. I'm known for liking not so great movies.
Which is maybe why you like Day After Tomorrow.
Such as Day After Tomorrow, which I love. But yeah, we can go into talking about that movie then.
Yeah.
I'll give just a little overview of what the movie is about for whoever maybe hasn't seen it. So this movie, made in 2004, features Dennis Quaid as Jack Hall, Jake Gyllenhaal as Sam Hall, and then Emmy Rossum as Laura Chapman. And Jack Hall is a scientist with NASA, and he's studying past climates through ice cores. He is kind of the main representation of science in the movie. And then the other part of the movie follows Sam Hall and Laura Chapman as they go on a school trip to New York, and then this big climate catastrophe kind of happens and the world freezes over, basically.
Yeah.
And Jack Hall is the one who's kind of ringing the bells to everybody in his organization and in government, and then he goes on a sort of rescue mission. In this span of maybe like a couple days. Do you have any opening thoughts on this film?
So this film was a blockbuster hit. It got panned by scientists. But something about this film that's actually very interesting to me is that the basis of what happens is not purely fantasy. It is something that could happen. In fact, it's something we're seeing happen. So the reason why this sort of ice age happens in the film, which is not realistic, but the reason why it happens is because they are showing the slowing of the Gulf Stream. And then in the film, the Gulf Stream actually stops. And the Gulf Stream brings warm water along the east coast of the United States and up close to the Arctic Circle and then dumps all that heat in Europe. So it keeps Europe warmer than it would be otherwise. And it moves a lot of heat around the Atlantic Ocean. And we are actually seeing the Gulf Stream slow down, in part because of ice melting off of Greenland, which is changing the salinity of the water and changing the density of the water, which is slowing down this major current that has huge climate effects. So that science is not inaccurate. The consequence of it stopping will be a cooling effect on Europe, but it will not be an ice age that occurs within 2 days and gets the whole northern hemisphere. That part is where it got really off the rails. And then there are these like holes in the atmosphere that like shoot super cooled air down. That part is absolutely beyond physically possible. But I do think that it's interesting that the film had this premise and that it was prescient in that way. It was in 2004 before we were seeing as much slowing of this part of the world's ocean current as much as we're seeing now. So that part is cool. You know, the storyline itself for me is really problematic. You've got this like crazy yeehaw scientist who, yes, he warns the government, which is awesome. And you do have a pretty realistic government representation where they ignore him until it's too late. But then he goes on this crazy rescue mission and he has to go alone, but then he takes 2 people with him and one of them dies and he like walks from New York City to, he walks from Washington, D.C. north to New York City in like a day and a half or something wild. That's where things get a little wonky for me. But again, the whole current change part I think is really interesting. So there is merit in the film. And I do show the film in my Cli-Fi class because it was really the beginning of the genre when it came to films. There were a few other films before it that had some climate aspects to them, but they didn't make it human-caused. And this film very specifically addresses the cause as human-caused global warming for the reason that this is happening. So that part is really cool too.
Yeah, I think noting the time the movie was made is important, especially hearing that it was kind of a first example of making movies like this. And it has been 20 years since then. And I agree with everything that you said. There are lots of little hidden gems that I think make it a valuable movie. So one of the kind of like hidden gems in this movie that I would like to talk about a little bit is its inclusion of the idea of climate refugees. So when New York and kind of the whole northern hemisphere of the United States starts to freeze over, we see people making the decision to either begin traveling south where this isn't happening or sheltering in place. And a lot of people in the movie do not make it. How do we see this idea of the climate refugee in the real world?
So what I do, and this is one part that I love about this movie, is that the climate refugees are the people from the wealthy nation, which is not what's happening in real life. But in the film, the U.S. citizens are migrating down to Mexico, but then also into South America. And there's this whole agreement that the governments come up with where in order to take the refugees from the north into the south, the debts that those countries have or with the United States are all forgiven so that they'll take our citizens. And this, I do think that's a great gem in the movie. Of course, right now, the migrations that we're seeing are the other way. There are a lot of the migrants that we see and a lot of the immigrants we see coming from the global south are moving north. And currently in the United States, we have immigration issues and lots of things that we're talking about politically when it comes to immigration. And one of the things that's not being discussed, or at least not enough, is how many and what percentage of those people who are moving north are coming because of climate reasons, because their agriculture isn't working the way it used to, because it is too hot or too dry. And that is actually a massive part of why people are moving north. And the other thing that we see is that when we have climate issues that cause food shortages or water shortages, we see an increase in global conflict, so wars. And so many people who are moving to new countries because of war, that war itself may have had a climate instigation. For example, Syria. Syria had a years-long drought that was part of what caused the instability that led to the regime change that started the civil war in Syria. So climate change is actually driving war and driving immigration all over the world. So sometimes it's just people trying to get away from a place that's uninhabitable. Sometimes it's trying to get away from conflict that started because of climate conditions. But we're seeing a lot of movement globally, and that's only going to increase as the climate continues to change.
It's all very complex how everything comes together to see this movement, but it's clear that climate change is an undercurrent in so many big picture things.
Yes.
Another example of that idea, maybe on a smaller scale, is like here in Florida with storms and hurricanes hitting the coast more harshly than inland. Especially recently, a lot of houses and communities were very impacted by the recent hurricanes. So that's kind of a closer to home example as well.
Yeah.
I think you can see it on lots of different scales.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And people just moving, slightly further inland out of flood zones. I mean, that is a form of climate migration in many ways, or moving to a different state within the United States or within a country, changing where they live. That's a form of climate migration as well.
This is not very related, but I rewatched Interstellar recently.
Ah, yes.
And with the people who I was watching it with, I was talking about this movie's so great. Like, it's all about space and it's so beautifully made and there's the great soundtrack. But then there's also this like background of the main characters living in this historically like agricultural area and really trying to make a living at it, but now it's just dust and like the world is kind of declining, the health of the earth is just declining, and that's why they're doing this whole thing. And I was so excited to talk about that part.
Climate communication in action.
Yeah.
You're doing it.
So that just it's not super connected, but that reminded me of it as well, with the pressures on like agricultural systems and making livings that way. Yeah.
And those are some of the consequences that people don't think about when they think of climate change. Generally people think of sea level rise or it getting hotter or increased storms, but they aren't thinking so much about the agricultural impacts or the public health impacts. We see increased rates of asthma now that can be due or can be attributed to climate change. We're seeing changes in infectious disease that are related to climate change. And those don't come to mind for most people, but they can make for great climate fiction.
Yeah, I was going to say that's, I think, also a strength of climate fiction is that it creates the connection for people between climate change and really any other issue ever.
Yes.
Before we move on to talking about our book example, I wanted to ask if you have any recommendations for movies or shows to watch. I know in the climate fiction class, you also watch one movie is Beasts of the Southern Wild, which is really beautiful.
Absolutely.
And then kind of a polar opposite example is Mad Max Fury Road. There's that one as well.
Yeah.
But do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, there are many films now that are either climate fiction or are meant to talk about climate change in some way. So yeah, Beasts of the Southern Wild is one of the older ones, and it's about hurricanes and flooding. And then there's Mad Max Fury Road, which you may not think of as a cli-fi movie, but if you're paying attention at the beginning, the setup for why this is happening is actually human-caused climate change, which is pretty cool. You just have to watch the intro. In the class, we watched Snowpiercer, which is a really interesting, weird film that gets into class struggles. But again, if you're paying attention in the beginning, the reason why the world has become covered in ice is because they did a geoengineering project to try to fix climate change. So they tried to actually intentionally alter the climate the other way, and it went too far. And it created this ice world. Not totally realistic, but it actually is a really good example of there is a possibility that if we intentionally tweak the climate, we could really mess it up. And then one of the more recent films, Don't Look Up, it's not about climate change. It's about an asteroid, but it's about climate change. And that's it's a metaphor for climate change. And it's actually funny, even though it has a super depressing ending. So those are the films we watch in the class. And I think that's a good array of different types of films that you can dig into that have climate themes.
Yeah.
Oh, and shows. The Last of Us is a climate show, which many people, they're like zombies, but it's actually a climate show. The reason why it's a fungus, right? The reason why the fungus can infect people and not just ants is because our core body temperatures have changed, and they've changed because of climate change. And spoiler alert, our bodies are actually changing. Our core temperature is actually changing because of climate change. So I don't know if an ant brain fungus is going to come infect us, but there is a scientific basis behind what becomes a zombie thriller series.
Yeah. I haven't heard that before, that our core temperatures are feeling
98.6 isn't actually accurate any longer.
Wow.
Yeah.
I do love The Last of Us, and I see lots of like little articles or blog posts or things like that pop up about the basis of The Last of Us and how that can apply to, what's actually happening and like where the idea came from and how it got from the real world idea to being part of the video game / show.
Yeah.
Oh, and then I was also going to respond to the Don't Look Up. When that came out, it got a lot of attention, I feel.
Yeah, a lot of attention.
Do you think that people are paying more attention to movies like that than they were in 2004, for example, or maybe just receiving them differently? Or
I mean, it's such a different film. Day After Tomorrow did really well, and a lot of people watched it, but they watched it as like an adventure action movie, and I don't know how many of the people in the general public were really thinking about how possible this is. And P.S., it wasn't that possible in the way it was depicted. But I think Don't Look Up really struck a different note in that it captured the frustration that many of us feel who are trying to communicate about climate change and aren't being listened to. And so I think there was a huge audience of folks who were feeling the frustration along with the main characters. And it was also entertaining and funny, and it had huge leads in it, right? It's Jennifer Lawrence and
Leonardo DiCaprio.
And so that also just brought in a different audience who might not have watched a cli-fi film, who wouldn't have watched something like Day After Tomorrow. So I think any attention is good attention. I'm excited that people watched it, and I hope we get more stuff like that soon. I hope you're listening, Netflix.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. So we've got a book here. We've got a nice stack of books.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing those in.
Of course.
There are a lot of climate fiction books,
Yes.
and also just books that can relate to like environmental science in general. Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to move on to talking about Migrations, which was published in 2020. It's a novel by Charlotte McConaughey. And if you would like to give us a little introduction to what the book is about.
I read this book. I loved this book. And this book follows the main character, Franny Stone, who is not a scientist, but she is really passionate about the impacts of climate change, particularly to this species of bird called the Arctic terns. And I think her fiance or boyfriend is a scientist, and so she learned a lot from him. But she's had these really catastrophic relationships in her life and has a lot of baggage, and makes the decision to stow away as a scientist on a fishing boat in order to study the Arctic terns as these folks go fishing. And she's going down, she's trying to capture what's happening to the migration of the Arctic tern and how it's changed because of climate change. And it's a roaring adventure as she's going to Greenland and then going down to Antarctica. So she's making this huge journey with these fishermen. And during the book, there are flashbacks to like really terrible things that happened in her life. So there's definitely like a content warning with this book. But it's beautifully done in that it captures so much about her life and her relationships while also having some really accurate science and bringing in some real interest to climate without making climate the sole conflict of the book. And it's very realistic. It's not sci-fi-y at all. So it's a really nice example of how literary fiction can be cli-fi.
Charlotte McConaughey, the author of Migrations, she did a really great job of pulling together really complicated, like, personal histories and relationship dynamics into what the main character is now doing, which is kind of trying to reconnect with nature and following the Arctic terns on their possibly last migration, which ties into her feeling that maybe it's her last migration as well, her kind of last final action to do in
even
her
though
life.
She's not old.
Yeah.
And I will say, I found, because this book there's some pretty sad and depressing moments in it, but it actually has a hopeful ending.
Yes.
Which I think is really important. It doesn't leave you feeling terrible at the end. So yeah, highly recommend. It's a really great book.
There is a scientific basis to it,
Yeah.
to a degree, because she knows a lot about
She knows
the
a
Arctic
lot.
terns.
She just doesn't have the training.
Yeah, and she's less than truthful about
Yes, she also lies.
her credentials, Using this as an example of climate fiction, what kind of message or feeling, you said the book kind of ended in hope.
Yeah.
What kind of message did you get from this, or what connection did you see between this book and what we're seeing happening with maybe other threatened species or the Arctic terns even, like in...
Yeah, so the depiction of what's happening with species and species migrations is very realistic in this book. And so we are actually seeing these kinds of things happen. And I think what this book does really well is connect the natural world to the human world and human experiences and how it even affects like the economy with like fishing and things like that. So this is, again, something that fiction can do, is help us see real-world consequences that might not have come to mind and that maybe wouldn't stick if somebody were just reading it from a textbook. Climate fiction in general, you know, one of the things that we see is that you can have a book that's set now or in the very near future. So Migrations is set basically in the very near future. You can have a book that's set 100 years from now or 300 years from now, and it's still, they all give us visions of the future. And I think I said this before, visions of possible futures. And this is what I think they're really important for communicating, and this is what I love about them, because even books that aren't super hopeful, I still get hope from them because they're still finding ways to build community or to adapt or to find beauty in what is otherwise maybe a world full of despair. And so for me, that's still a hopeful future. The idea that we have a future is hopeful to me. And that's what I love. Some of these books are actually quite hopeful. I brought New York 2140, which depicts what New York City will look like in the year 2140, and it's completely revamped. People live in the tallest parts of the high rises, and there are people travel by boat, and there are like sky bridges between the buildings. And it's you look at it or you read it and you say, I could see this happening. This makes me feel hopeful that people will still be thriving in the future, even if the worst consequences come, because the ocean has risen and everything is underwater. So yeah, depicting possible futures, I think, is what's so important. And because it helps us to imagine. And I think one of the things that we often lack when we are fearing something or feeling hopeless or despair is imagination, the ability to imagine what could be different, how we could solve the problem. And so that ability to bring in and make us use our imagination, I think, is what's really important about Cli-Fi.
That's a great way to capture what kind of different books can do. Like with Migrations, I feel like it taps mostly into emotions very strongly.
Yeah.
And whereas some other books tap more into the imagination side of it, everything kind of has like a different piece that it hits on. I think there's a book out there for everybody for what they're looking for.
100%.
Like, I read Migrations, which is more emotional and like personal, and I think it shows a great example of how connected somebody can be to nature. And then I've read other things where it's kind of a wild idea of the future that's maybe not so wild, but it gets me thinking about possible solutions or possible ways that we can adapt to the world that's changing no matter what. Maybe we can turn the change to not be so bad or to not be negative, but the world will still change and we'll still like find possibly futures like sky bridges. And I don't know if it was part of the Cli-Fi class, but there was this book with a bunch of short stories in it.
That was Cli-Fi.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, there's one specific story in there that I think about like relatively often, and I don't remember too much from it, but I remember that I think they had like repurposed a stadium or...
Yes, that story is called The Eighth Wonder. Yeah. And there's a major hurricane in Houston and they repurpose the Astrodome and like make their own like commune living inside of it. But there's a lot of terrible things that happen.
Yes.
But by the end, it's hopeful. Like they're all living in this society together inside of the Astrodome because the rest of Houston is flooded. Yeah.
I think about that a lot in the ideas of like reworking what we already have and then finding a way forward.
Yeah.
Do you see consuming media like this translating into taking action, or is it maybe getting the ball rolling or supplementing other things that would push people to action? How do you think this kind of media relates to that part, if it's not explicitly said? Yeah. Sometimes in books they do say, or in certain media, they do provide like resources or urge people to do this, but...
Yeah, most of these aren't prescriptive. They aren't telling you need to do this thing. In fact, I can't think of a single one that actually does that.
The only example I could think of is a children's book.
Yes. Children's books always have that. But the moral has to be really clear for kids. I think that they can do all of the things that you listed. I think it can get people to care more because it can, like you said, there's a Cli-Fi book for everyone. And so if you find the one that resonates with you, it might actually inspire you by relating it to something you care about. And so I think it can serve as inspiration for people to to take action and to start caring more. It can be something that sort of startles someone, like they were recommended the book for other reasons, and then the climate themes were not something they were necessarily anticipating, and then they started to make those connections on their own. So it can be informative in that way. Again, the idea that it helps us imagine futures, I think that it can inspire hope and give us something that we want to work towards. I think we're so often told in climate communication of the thing that we're supposed to be avoiding. You don't want this, we don't want this future, but we're not given very many examples of what we do want. What do you want to be fighting for, not what do you want to be fighting against? And climate fiction, in all of the media forms that it takes, can give us that. It can give us a picture of what we want to be fighting for. That kind of inspiration, I think, is invaluable.
Great. So wrapping up that section, you mentioned a couple books in this pile here, but do you have any other recommendations for maybe a couple books that are different from one another?
Yeah. I don't want to move away from my microphone. In the pile here, I have Weather. So Weather is written as, it's almost like a diary, and it's basically set now or maybe even like a few years ago. And this woman is going about her average daily life, but she's contemplating the consequences of climate change in the background. So it's this really interesting insight into what's going on inside of somebody's head, what's sort of just happening in her everyday life. But climate change is playing in the background in a way that I think a lot of folks can relate to. So super realistic, set now or even a little bit ago. Versus New York 2140 I talked about is sort of the other end of the spectrum, where it's far in the future and we've adapted to climate change, and there's a story happening with, kids and people in the building, that they all live in one building together, and there's all these, relationship stories happening, but it's set in this backdrop of this crazy world where we're boating everywhere in New York City. Another one that's in that sort of end of the spectrum is Camp Zero. This is a relatively new book. I think it's 2023 or 22. And it is it's following this one woman's story as well as these other women that she ends up spending a lot of time with. And she is in the Arctic Circle, like trying to create a new way of living. Really fascinating. So there's, again, like this whole spectrum of different books that you can read. Oh, one more ocean-themed one, The Wall. This one is set in what is basically England, or you're led to believe it's England. And the country has built this massive seawall around it so that the ocean is far, far above ground level, but they're behind this massive wall, and everybody's living down, below sea level. And everybody at a certain point in their life has to serve as a watcher on the wall, and they're waiting for migrants to come from other parts of the world and try to keep them out. And, I don't want to spoil what happens, but they end up feeling a little bit more sympathy for the folks on the other side of the wall eventually. But sea level rise is a prominent theme in that one. So you can really get all kinds, scratch your itch no matter what you're interested in.
I would also, for movies and books or any kind of media like that, encourage people to, even if you don't approach it thinking that it is climate fiction or relates to climate change at all, look for that in books, because a lot of times you can find little pieces in things, and like with Mad Max, like we were talking about,
little Easter eggs.
It's really interesting to see where that comes in different media.
Yeah, and then tell me about it, because I want to catch all of them.
There are also lots of sources online where you can find things that are very specifically climate
lists.
fiction. Yes. Well, we've covered lots of ground. Do you have any final things that you would like to add? Or
I just want to encourage everybody to have climate change conversations, remembering you can relate it to anything that's going on in your life. Really, climate change touches every other subject that's out there. And like I said before, if we're not talking about it, then we're not doing anything about it. So the easiest and most impactful thing each of us can be doing is talking about it as much as possible. So have those conversations, please.
even if they're hard sometimes.
Yeah, and they won't be as hard as you think.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us on Shellphone.
Thank you for having me.
Great to talk to you again. Yeah. Thanks for tuning into Shellphone. You can find Jo on Instagram and TikTok at the Climate Convo Prof for great discussions and resources related to climate change. To learn more about our projects, suggest a guest, or donate to the show, visit our website at breachthesurface.org or social media at breachthesurface and at Shellphone Podcast.